Hello AP, this is our second and last screencast on analysis writing in preparation for the AP exam. I'm recording this on the same day it was delivered in class, Tuesday, April 28th. Today, we're going to talk about how to embed quotations in your analysis writing, primarily because in my reading of your analysis writing, I've noticed a lot of big, long, almost paragraph length quotations. That is not going to be effective on the AP exam primarily because the AP grader doesn't want to read too much evidence from the text. They want to know your response and your thoughts on the text. So we're going to talk about how to cut down quotations in your analysis writing. Let's start by talking about what portions of the text you should use. I want you to read with the author's purpose in mind, once you've identified the author's purpose, and find the portion of the text that is a real eureka moment for you. If you're not sure what I'm referring to when I say eureka, this is Archimedes. He was a Greek philosopher, scientist, because they were usually both back then. He realized when getting into a bathtub that his body mass displaced the water. And because he was the first scientist philosopher to come across this idea that a body's mass can take the place of another mass. This is a non-physicist explaining this. He realized this was a major idea. He had a eureka moment, which in the ancient Greek meant, I've found it, I've discovered it, I've realized it. The story goes that Archimedes was so excited by this that he jumped out of the bathtub, dripping wet, and ran down the streets with just joy and elation from his discovery. So I don't expect you to run through the streets naked and dripping, but what I do expect you to do is, while reading, find the portions that are eureka moments for you. By this I mean the portions that really clarify the author's purpose, because the portions that really clarify the author's purpose are probably particularly effective for you. That means they're probably also structurally and rhetorically effective. So now that we've talked about those eureka moments, the portions of the text for you to use in your writing, let's talk about how you need to explain those rhetorical devices, because it is not enough simply to identify. That is the first thing you want to do. You want to identify what kind of rhetorical device or structure the author uses, but that's not enough. AP scorers have told me in the past that students who are just adequate or maybe even inadequate simply identify, for example, a simile. Instead of just identifying, you must make sure that you are breaking down and explaining the rhetorical device for your reader. And you can do that by providing context to the device, basically explaining why the author uses it where he does. You should explain how the rhetorical device contributes to the author's purpose. You should consider what the text would lack if that rhetorical device was not there. It's kind of a different way of approaching this. Instead of stating what it does, state what the text would be missing if that device wasn't there. Basically, what I want you to do is explain the rhetorical device 90% in your own words and use 10% of your explanation should be the actual quote to drive home the point. Remember, these AP scorers are not there to reread the author's writing. They're there to read your interpretation and your analysis of the author's writing. So in your packets, your first prompt is the 2007 prompt that asks you to read and analyze a text by Sanders. Sanders is responding to Rushdie, and he's responding to Rushdi's idea that migrants or people traveling bring something good in their travels, ideas along with them. The overall purpose of this essay is, of course, that Sanders disagrees with Rushdie. He thinks that there are negatives associated with these travelers. And in the third paragraph, Sanders uses the examples of Spanish explorers, North American colonists, Depression-era migrant farmers to show that migrants, immigrants, can actually be destructive with the ideas that they bring. So what I've done here is I've laid out a summary of both what Sanders believes in the passage as a whole and what Sanders is arguing in the third paragraph. Now I'm going to bring in the rhetorical device that he uses to prove this, a simile, or I should say that he uses to illustrate this idea. So as I say in this third bullet point, he punctuates his example with a simile. And the simile is this idea that the mind is like a cookie cutter and the land is like dough. These migrants force their ideas, their cultures onto the people and the land that they travel to. Notice I also cite the line number from the text. This, of course, is a simile, but I'm explaining that here. It's a simile that describes how Sanders believes that the migrants are forcing the land to conform. Sanders overall is arguing that migrant people trying to make their ideas and practices work in a new place is not just ineffective, but it can actually be harmful. So I bring it back to Sanders' overall argument about Salman Rushdie's opinion. So let's break down those ideas. My first two here, Sanders argues that moving is less valuable than Rushdie believes, and then in the third paragraph he uses examples. He alludes to Spanish explorers, North American colonists, and Depression-era migrant farmers. These are both me summarizing the author's purpose. It's important to start or to include this in your body paragraph because it helps the reader see that you're connecting your ideas back to the overall purpose of the passage and the purpose in that portion of the passage. Next, I have here one little piece of quote. I've embedded this quotation into a sentence, and you might be wondering how to do that. Well, the key is use a verb. So you know that you're writing about the author and how the author writes this passage or has written this passage. You can use verbs such as the author states, the author includes, the author argues, the author writes. These words help you construct a sentence that can end with a quote from the text, a small quote from the text. Notice only about 10% of my overall explanation is quote. The majority is my own words. Now the reason you're using these verbs and not a verb like says, the author says, is because these verbs indicate the writing process. To use the word says is actually kind of illogical. The writer's not talking here, he's writing. So these are not the only verbs you can use, but they're ones that I suggest you having in your repertoire when embedding quotations into sentences. Lastly, you always want to finish with an explanation of the rhetorical device, such as me explaining the simile, and connect it back to the author's overall purpose. It's basically include your warrant. Connect the evidence back to the author's purpose for writing this portion. So this is what you need to do now. Read the text from at least 2 of the prompts. Look for those eureka moments, the places where you really understand and are able to articulate the author's purpose. Those portions are going to be the really effective rhetorical devices. Practice paraphrasing portions of the text, as we talked about in this presentation. And then remember, 10% of your body should be the quote, and 90% should be your paraphrasing and your explanation. The AP scorers don't want to read big, long blocks of quotations. Instead, they want your words, your ideas, and only using minimal quotation as support. Thanks so much. This has been How to Embed Quotations in Analysis Writing.